This is a continuation of The Beetle by Richard Marsh, comprising chapters 5 through 9. Chapter 5. An instruction to commit burglary. That the man in the bed was the one whom, to my cost, I had suffered myself to stumble on the night before, there could of course not be the faintest doubt, and yet, directly I saw him, I recognized that some astonishing alteration had taken place in his appearance. To begin with, he seemed younger. The decrepitude of age had given place to something very like the fire of youth. His features had undergone some subtle change. His nose, for instance, was not by any means so grotesque. Its beak-like quality was less conspicuous. The most part of his wrinkles had disappeared, as if by magic, and though his skin was still as yellow as saffron, his contours had rounded. He had even come into possession of a modest allowance of chin. But the most astounding novelty was that about the face there was something which was essentially feminine, so feminine, indeed, that I wondered if I could by any possibility have blundered and mistaken a woman for a man, some ghoulish example of her sex, who had so yielded to her depraved instincts as to have become nothing but a ghastly reminiscence of womanhood. The effect of the changes which had come about in his appearance, for, after all, I told myself that it was impossible that I could have been such a simpleton as to have been mistaken on such a question as gender was heightened by the self-evident fact that, very recently, he had been engaged in some pitched battle, some hand-to-hand, and, probably, discreditable encounter, from which he had borne away uncomfortable proofs of his opponent's prowess. His antagonist could hardly have been a chivalrous fighter, for his countenance was marked by a dozen different scratches which seemed to suggest that the weapons used had been someone's fingernails. It was, perhaps, because the heat of the battle was still in his veins that he was in such a state of excitement. He seemed to be almost overwhelmed by the strength of his own feelings. His eyes seemed literally to flame with fire. The muscles of his face were working as if they were wholly beyond his own control. When he spoke, his accent was markedly foreign. The words rushed from his lips in an inarticulate torrent. He kept repeating the same thing over and over again in a fashion which was not a little suggestive of insanity. "So you're not dead. You're not dead. You're alive. You're alive. Well, how does it feel to be dead? I ask you. Is it not good to be dead? To keep dead is better. It is the best of all. To have made an end of all things, to cease to strive and to cease to weep, to cease to want and to cease to have, to cease to annoy and to cease to long, to no more care, no, not for anything, to put from you the curse of life, forever. Is that not the best? Oh yes, I tell you, do I not know? But for you such knowledge is not yet. For you there is the return to life, the coming out of death. You shall live on. For me, live on." He made a movement with his hand, and directly he did so, it happened as on the previous evening, that a metamorphosis took place in the very abysses of my being. I woke from my torpor, as he put it. I came out of death and was alive again. I was far, yet, from being my own man. I realized that he exercised on me a degree of mesmeric force which I had never dreamed that one creature could exercise on another. But, at least, I was no longer in doubt as to whether I was or was not dead. I knew I was alive. He lay, watching me, as if he was reading the thoughts which occupied my brain, and, for all I know, he was. "Robert Holt, you are a thief." "I am not." My own voice, as I heard it, startled me. It was so long since it had sounded in my ears. "You are a thief. Only thieves come through windows. Did you not come through the window? I was still. What would my contradiction have availed me? But it is well that you came through the window. Well, you are a thief. Well, for me. For me. It is you that I am wanting. At the happy moment you have dropped yourself into my hands in the nick of time. For you are my slave at my beck and call, my familiar spirit, to do with as I will. You know this, eh? I did know it, and the knowledge of my impotence was terrible. I felt that if I could only get away from him, only release myself from the bonds with which he had bound me about, only remove myself from the horrible glamour of his near neighborhood, only get 1 or 2 square meals, and have an opportunity of recovering from the enervating stress of mental and bodily fatigue. I felt that then I might be something like his match, and that, a second time, he would endeavor in vain to bring me within the compass of his magic. But as it was, I was conscious that I was helpless, and the consciousness was agony. He persisted in reiterating his former falsehood. "I say you are a thief. A thief, Robert Holt, a thief. You came through a window for your own pleasure. Now you will go through a window for mine. Not this window, but another where the jest lay I did not perceive, but it tickled him, for a grating sound came from his throat which was meant for laughter. This time it is as a thief that you will go. Oh yes, be sure." He paused, as it seemed, to transfix me with his gaze. His unblinking eyes never for an instant quitted my face. With what a frightful fascination they constrained me, and how I loathed them. When he spoke again there was a new intonation in his speech, something bitter, cruel, unrelenting. "Do you know Paul Lessingham?" He pronounced the name as if he hated it, and yet as if he loved to have it on his tongue. "What Paul Lessingham?" "There is only one Paul Lessingham. The Paul Lessingham, the great Paul Lessingham." He shrieked, rather than said this, with an outburst of rage so frenzied that I thought, for the moment, that he was going to spring on me and rend me. I shook all over. I do not doubt that, as I replied, my voice was sufficiently tremulous. All the world knows Paul Lessingham, the politician, the statesman. As he glared at me, his eyes dilated. I still stood in expectation of a physical assault, but for the present he contented himself with words. Tonight you are going through his window like a thief. I had no inkling of his meaning, and apparently judging from his next words, I looked something of the bewilderment I felt. You do not understand? No, it is simple. What could be simpler? I say that tonight. You are going through his window like a thief. You came through my window, why not through the window of Paul Lessingham, the politician, the statesman? He repeated my words as if in mockery. I make it my boast of that great multitude which regards Paul Lessingham as the greatest living force in practical politics, and which looks to him with confidence to carry through that great work of constitutional and social reform which he has set himself to do. I dare see that my tone, in speaking of him, savoured of laudation, which, plainly, the man in the bed resented. What he meant by his wild words about my going through Paul Lessingham's window like a thief, I still had not the faintest notion. They sounded like the ravings of a madman. As I continued silent, and he yet stared, there came into his tone another note, a note of tenderness, a note of which I had not deemed him capable. He is good to look at. Paul Lessingham, is he not good to look at? I was aware that, physically, Mr. Lessingham was a fine specimen of manhood, but I was not prepared for the assertion of the fact in such a quarter, nor for the manner in which the temporary master of my fate continued to harp and enlarge upon the theme. He is straight as the mast of a ship. He is tall. His skin is white. He is strong. Do I not know that he is strong? How strong? Oh yes. Is there a better thing than to be his wife, his well-beloved? The light of his eyes. Is there for a woman a happier chance? Oh no, not one. His wife, Paul Lessingham. As, with soft cadences, he gave vent to these unlooked-for sentiments, the fashion of his countenance was changed. A look of longing came into his face, of savage, frantic longing which, unalluring though it was, for the moment transfigured him. But the mood was transient. To be his wife. Oh yes, the wife of his scorn, the despised and rejected. The return to the venom of his former bitterness was rapid. I could not but feel that this was the natural man, though why a creature such as he was should go out of his way to apostrophize, in such a manner, a publicist of Mr. Lessingham's eminence, surpassed my comprehension. Yet he stuck to his subject like a leech, as if it had been one in which he had an engrossing personal interest. He is a devil, hard as the granite rock, cold as the snows of Ararat. In him there is none of life's warm blood. He is accursed. He is false. False as the fables of those who lie for love of lies. He is all treachery. Her whom he has taken to his bosom, he would put away from him. As if she had never been, he would steal from her like a thief in the night. He would forget she ever was. But the avenger follows after, lurking in the shadows, hiding among the rocks, waiting, watching, till his time shall come. And it shall come. The day of the avenger. The day. Raising himself to a sitting posture, he threw his arms above his head and shrieked with a demoniac fury. Presently he became a trifle calmer. Reverting to his recumbent position, resting his head upon his hand, he eyed me steadily, then asked me a question which struck me as being, under the circumstances, more than a little singular. You know his house, the house of the great Paul Lessingham, the politician, the statesman? I do not. You lie, you do. The words came from him with a sort of snarl, as if he would have lashed me across the face with them. I do not. Men in my position are not acquainted with the residences of men in his. I may, at some time, have seen his address in print, but if so, I have forgotten it. He looked at me intently, for some moments, as if to learn if I spoke the truth, and apparently at last was satisfied that I did. You do not know it? Well, I will show it you. I will show the house of the great Paul Lessingham. What he meant I did not know, but I was soon to learn. An astounding revelation it proved to be. There was about his manner something hardly human, something which, for want of a better phrase, I would call vulpine. In his tone there was a mixture of mockery and bitterness, as if he wished his words to have the effect of corrosive sublimate and to sear me as he uttered them. Listen with all your ears. Give me your whole attention. Hearken to my bidding, so that you may do as I bid you. Not that I fear your obedience, oh no. He paused, as if to enable me to fully realize the picture of my helplessness conjured up by his jibes. You came through my window, like a thief. You will go through my window, like a fool. You will go to the house of the great Paul Lessingham. You say you do not know it? Well, I will show it you. I will be your guide. Unseen, in the darkness and the night, I will stalk beside you, and will lead you to where I would have you go. You will go just as you are, with bare feet and head uncovered, and with but a single garment to hide your nakedness. You will be cold, your feet will be cut and bleeding. But what better does a thief deserve? If any see you, at the least they will take you for a madman, there will be trouble, but have no fear, bear a bold heart. None shall see you while I stalk at your side. I will cover you with the cloak of invisibility, so that you may come in safety to the house of the great Paul Lessingham." He paused again. What he said, wild and wanton though it was beginning to fill me with a sense of the most extreme discomfort. His sentences, in some strange, indescribable way, seemed as they came from his lips to warp my limbs, to enwrap themselves about me, to confine me tighter and tighter within, as it were, swaddling clothes, to make me more and more helpless. I was already conscious that whatever mad freak he chose to set me on, I should have no option but to carry it through. "When you come to the house, you will stand and look and seek for a window convenient for entry. It may be that you will find one open, as you did mine. If not, you will open one." "How?" "That is your affair, not mine. You will practice the arts of a thief to steal into his house." The monstrosity of his suggestion fought against the spell which he again was casting upon me, and forced me into speech, endowed me with the power to show that there still was in me something of a man, though every second the strands of my manhood, as it seemed, were slipping faster through the fingers which were strained to clutch them. "I will not." He was silent. He looked at me. The pupils of his eyes dilated until they seemed all pupil. "You will. Do you hear? I say you will. I am not a thief. I am an honest man. Why should I do this thing? Because I bid you. Have mercy." "On whom? On you, or on Paul Lessingham, who, at any time, has shown mercy unto me, that I should show mercy unto any." He stopped, and then again went on, reiterating his former incredible suggestion with an emphasis which seemed to eat its way into my brain. "You will practice the arts of a thief to steal into his house, and being in will listen. If all be still, you will make your way to the room he calls his study." "How shall I find it? I know nothing of his house." The question was wrung from me. I felt that the sweat was standing in great drops upon my brow. "I will show it you." "Shall you go with me?" "Aye, I shall go with you. All the time I shall be with you. You will not see me, but I shall be there. Be not afraid." His claim to supernatural powers, for what he said amounted to nothing less, was, on the face of it, preposterous, but, then, I was in no condition to even hint at its absurdity. He continued, "When you have gained the study, you will go to a certain drawer, which is in a certain bureau, in a corner of the room. I see it now. When you are there, you shall see it too, and you will open it. Should it be locked? You still will open it. But how shall I open it if it is locked? By those arts in which a thief is skilled. I say to you again that that is your affair, not mine." I made no attempt to answer him, even supposing that he forced me by the wicked and unconscionable exercise of what I presumed were the hypnotic powers with which nature had to such a dangerous degree endowed him to carry the adventure to a certain stage, since he could hardly, at an instant's notice, endow me with the knack of picking locks, should the drawer he alluded to be locked, which might Providence permit. Nothing serious might issue from it after all. He read my thoughts. "You will open it, though it be doubly and trebly locked. I say that you will open it. In it you will find," he hesitated, as if to reflect, "some letters. It may be 2 or 3. I know not just how many. They are bound about by a silken ribbon. You will take them out of the drawer, and, having taken them, you will make the best of your way out of the house, and bear them back to me. And should anyone come upon me while engaged in these nefarious proceedings, for instance, should I encounter Mr. Lessingham himself, what then? Paul Lessingham, you need have no fear if you encounter him. I need have no fear. If he finds me in his own house at dead of night, committing burglary, you need have no fear of him. On your account, or on my own, at least he will have me haled to gaol. I say you need have no fear of him. I say what I mean. How, then, shall I escape his righteous vengeance? He is not the man to suffer a midnight robber to escape him scatheless. Shall I have to kill him? You will not touch him with a finger, nor will he touch you. By what spell shall I prevent him? By the spell of 2 words. What words are they? Should Paul Lessingham chance to come upon you, and find you in his house, a thief, and should seek to stay you from whatever it is you may be at, you will not flinch nor flee from him, but you will stand still, and you will say. Something in the crescendo accents of his voice, something weird and ominous, caused my heart to press against my ribs, so that when he stopped, in my eagerness I cried out, "What?" "The Beetle." As the words came from him in a kind of screech, the lamp went out, and the place was all in darkness, and I knew, so that the knowledge filled me with a sense of loathing, that with me, in the room, was the evil presence of the night before. 2 bright specks gleamed in front of me, something flopped from off the bed onto the ground. The thing was coming towards me across the floor. It came slowly on, and on, and on. I stood still, speechless in the sickness of my horror, until, on my bare feet, it touched me with slimy feelers, and my terror, lest it should creep up my naked body, lent me voice, and I fell shrieking like a soul in agony. It may be that my shrieking drove it from me. At least it went. I knew it went, and all was still, until, on a sudden, the lamp flamed out again, and there, lying, as before in bed, glaring at me with his baleful eyes, was the being whom, in my folly, or in my wisdom, whichever it was, I was beginning to credit with the possession of unhallowed, unlawful powers. You will say that to him. Those two words, they only, no more, and you will see what you will see. But Paul Lessingham is a man of resolution. Should he still persist in interference, or seek to hinder you, you will say those two words again. You need do no more. Twice will suffice, I promise you. Now go. Draw up the blind, open the window, climb through it. Hasten to do what I have bidden you. I wait here for your return, and all the way I shall be with you. Chapter 6. A singular felony. I went to the window, I drew up the blind, unlatching the sash. I threw it open, and clad, or rather unclad as I was, I clambered through it into the open air. I was not only incapable of resistance, I was incapable of distinctly formulating the desire to offer resistance. Some compelling influence moved me hither and hither, with completest disregard of whether I would nor would not. And yet, when I found myself without, I was conscious of a sense of exultation at having escaped from the miasmic atmosphere of that room of unholy memories, and a faint hope began to dawn within my bosom, that as I increased the distance between myself and it, I might shake off something of the nightmare helplessness which numbed and tortured me. I lingered for a moment by the window, then stepped over the short dividing wall into the street, and then again I lingered. My condition was one of dual personality. While physically I was bound, mentally, to a considerable extent I was free. But this measure of freedom on my mental side made my plight no better, for, among other things, I realized what a ridiculous figure I must be cutting, barefooted and bareheaded, abroad, at such an hour of the night, in such a boisterous breeze. For I quickly discovered that the wind amounted to something like a gale. Apart from all other considerations, the notion of parading the streets in such a condition filled me with profound disgust. And I do believe that if my tyrannical oppressor had only permitted me to attire myself in my own garments, I should have started with a comparatively light heart on the felonious mission on which he apparently was sending me. I believe, too, that the consciousness of the incongruity of my attire increased my sense of helplessness, and that, had I been dressed as Englishmen are wont to be, who take their walks abroad, he would not have found in me, on that occasion, the facile instrument which, in fact, he did. There was a moment in which the gravelled pathway first made itself known to my naked feet, and the cutting wind to my naked flesh, when I think it possible that, had I gritted my teeth, and strained my every nerve, I might have shaken myself free from the bonds which shackled me, and bade defiance to the ancient sinner, who, for all I knew, was peeping at me through the window. But so depressed was I by the knowledge of the ridiculous appearance I presented that, before I could take advantage of it, the moment passed, not to return again that night. I did catch, as it were, at its fringe, as it was flying past me, making a hurried movement to one side, the first I had made, of my own initiative for hours, but it was too late. My tormentor, as if though unseen he saw tightened his grip, I was whirled round, and sped hastily onwards in a direction in which I certainly had no desire of travelling. All the way I never met a soul. I have since wondered whether in that respect my experience was not a normal one, whether it might not have happened to any. If so, there are streets in London, long lines of streets which, at a certain period of the night, in a certain sort of weather, probably the weather had something to do with it, are clean deserted, in which there is neither foot passenger nor vehicle, not even a policeman. The greater part of the route along which I was driven, I know no juster word, was one with which I had some sort of acquaintance. It led at first through what, I take it, was some part of Walham Green, then along the Lily Road, through Brompton, across the Fulham Road, through the network of streets leading to Sloane Street, across Sloane Street into Launder Square. Who goes that way goes some distance, and goes through some important thoroughfares, yet not a creature did I see, nor, I imagine, was there a creature who saw me. As I crossed Sloane Street, I fancied that I heard the distant rumbling of a vehicle along the Knightsbridge Road, but that was the only sound I heard. It is painful even to recollect the plight in which I was when I was stopped, for stopped I was, as shortly and as sharply, as the beast of burden, with a bridle in its mouth, whose driver puts a period to his career. I was wet, intermittent gusts of rain were borne on the scurrying wind. In spite of the pace at which I had been brought, I was chilled to the bone, and worst of all, my mud-stained feet, all cut and bleeding, were so painful, for unfortunately, I was still susceptible enough to pain that it was agony to have them come into contact with the cold and the slime of the hard, unyielding pavement. I had been stopped on the opposite side of the square, but nearest to the hospital, in front of a house which struck me as being somewhat smaller than the rest. It was a house with a portico. About the pillars of this portico was trellis work, and on the trellis work was trained some climbing plant. As I stood shivering, wondering what would happen next, some strange impulse mastered me, and, immediately, to my own unbounded amazement, I found myself scrambling up the trellis towards the veranda above. I am no gymnast, Either by nature or by education, I doubt whether, previously, I had ever attempted to climb anything more difficult than a step-ladder. The result was that, though the impulse might be given me, the skill could not, and I had only ascended a yard or so when, losing my footing, I came slithering down upon my back. Bruised and shaken though I was not allowed to inquire into my injuries. In a moment I was on my feet again, and again I was impelled to climb, only, however, again to come to grief. This time the demon, or whatever it was, that had entered into me, seeming to appreciate the impossibility of getting me to the top of that veranda, directed me to try another way. I mounted the steps leading to the front door, got onto the low parapet which was at one side, thence onto the sill of the adjacent window. Had I slipped then, I should have fallen a sheer descent of at least 20 feet to the bottom of the deep area down below. But the sill was broad, and if it is proper to use such language in connection with a transaction, with the sort in which I was engaged, fortune favoured me. I did not fall. In my clenched fist I had a stone. With this I struck the pane of glass, as with a hammer. Through the hole which resulted, I could just insert my hand, and reach the latch within. In another minute the sash was raised, and I was in the house. I had committed burglary. As I look back and reflect upon the audacity of the whole proceeding, even now I tremble, hapless slave of another's will, although in very truth I was. I cannot repeat too often that I realized to the full just what it was that I was being compelled to do, a fact which was very far from rendering my situation less distressful, and every detail of my involuntary actions was projected upon my brain in a series of pictures, whose clear-cut outlines, so long as memory endures, will never fade. Certainly no professional burglar, nor, indeed, any creature in his senses, would have ventured to emulate my surprising rashness. The process of smashing the pane of glass, it was plate glass, was anything but a noiseless one. There was, first, the blow itself, then the shivering of the glass, then the clattering of fragments into the area beneath. One would have thought that the whole thing would have made din enough to have roused the 7 sleepers. But here, again, the weather was on my side. About that time the wind was howling wildly. It came shrieking across the square. It is possible that the tumult which it made deadened all other sounds. Anyhow, as I stood within the room which I had violated, listening for signs of someone being on the alert, I could hear nothing. Within the house there seemed to be the silence of the grave. I drew down the window and made for the door. It proved by no means easy to find. The windows were obscured by heavy curtains, so that the room inside was dark as pitch. It appeared to be unusually full of furniture, an appearance due, perhaps, to my being a stranger in the midst of such Cimmerian blackness. I had to feel my way, very gingerly indeed, among the various impedimenta. As it was, I seemed to come into contact with most of the obstacles there were to come into contact with, stumbling more than once over footstools, and over what seemed to be dwarf chairs. It was a miracle that my movements still continued to be unheard, but I believe that the explanation was that the house was well built, that the servants were the only persons in it at the time, that their bedrooms were on the top floor, that they were fast asleep, and that they were little likely to be disturbed by anything that might occur in the room which I had entered. Reaching the door at last, I opened it, listening for any promise of being interrupted, and to adapt a hackneyed phrase directed by the power which shaped my end. I went across the hall and up the stairs. I passed up the first landing, and, on the second, moved to a door upon the right. I turned the handle, it yielded, the door opened, I entered, closing it behind me. I went to the wall just inside the door, found a handle, jerked it, and switched on the electric light, doing, I make no doubt, all these things from a spectator's point of view, so naturally that a judge and jury would have been with difficulty persuaded that they were not the product of my own volition. In the brilliant glow of the electric light I took a leisurely survey of the contents of the room. It was, as the man in the bed had said it would be, a study, a fine, spacious apartment, evidently intended rather for work than for show. There were 3 separate writing tables, 1 very large and 2 smaller ones, all covered with an orderly array of manuscripts and papers. A typewriter stood at the side of one. On the floor, under and about them, were piles of books, portfolios, and official-looking documents. Every available foot of wall space on 3 sides of the room was lined with shelves, full as they could hold with books. On the 4th side, facing the door, was a large lock-up oak bookcase, and, in the farther corner, a quaint old bureau. So soon as I saw this bureau I went for it, straight as an arrow from a bow. Indeed, it would be no abuse of metaphor to say that I was propelled towards it like an arrow from a bow. It had drawers below, glass doors above, and between the drawers and the doors was a flap to let down. It was to this flap my attention was directed. I put out my hand to open it. It was locked at the top. I pulled at it with both hands. It refused to budge. So this was the lock I was, if necessary, to practice the arts of a thief to open. I was no picklock. I had flattered myself that nothing, and no one, could make me such a thing. Yet now that I found myself confronted by that unyielding flap, I found that pressure, irresistible pressure, was being put upon me to gain, by any and every means, access to its interior. I had no option but to yield. I looked about me in search of some convenient tool with which to ply the felon's trade. I found it close beside me. Leaning against the wall, within a yard of where I stood, were examples of various kinds of weapons, among them spearheads. Taking one of these spearheads, with much difficulty I forced the point between the flap and the bureau. Using the leverage thus obtained, I attempted to prise it open. The flap held fast. The spearhead snapped in two. I tried another, with the same result, a third, to fail again. There were no more. The most convenient thing remaining was a queer, heavy-headed, sharp-edged hatchet. This I took, brought the sharp edge down with all my force upon the refractory flap. The hatchet went through. Before I had done with it, it was open with a vengeance. But I was destined on the occasion of my first, and I trust, last experience of the burglar's calling, to carry the part completely through. I had gained access to the flap itself only to find that at the back were several small drawers, on one of which my observation was brought to bear in a fashion which it was quite impossible to disregard. As a matter of course it was locked, and once more I had to search for something which would serve as a rough and ready substitute for the missing key. There was nothing at all suitable among the weapons. I could hardly for such a purpose use the hatchet. The drawer in question was such a little one that to have done so would have been to shiver it to splinters. On the mantel-shelf, in an open leather case, were a pair of revolvers. Statesmen nowadays sometimes stand in actual peril of their lives. It is possible that Mr. Lessingham, conscious of continually threatened danger, carried them about with him as a necessary protection. They were serviceable weapons, large and somewhat weighty, of the type with which, I believe, upon occasion the police are armed. Not only were all the barrels loaded, but in the case itself there was a supply of cartridges more than sufficient to charge them all again. I was handling the weapons, wondering if, in my condition, the word was applicable what use I could make of them to enable me to gain admission to that drawer, when there came, on a sudden, from the street without, the sound of approaching wheels. There was a whirring within my brain, as if someone was endeavoring to explain to me to what service to apply the revolvers, and I, perforce, strained every nerve to grasp the meaning of my invisible mentor. While I did so, the wheels drew rapidly nearer, and, just as I was expecting them to go whirling by, stopped in front of the house. My heart leapt in my bosom. In a convulsion of frantic terror, again during the passage of one frenzied moment, I all but burst the bonds that held me, and fled haphazard from the imminent peril. But the bonds were stronger than I. It was as if I had been rooted to the ground. A key was inserted in the keyhole of the front door. The lock was turned. The door thrown open. Firm footsteps entered the house. If I could, I would not have stood upon the order of my going, but gone at once, anywhere, anyhow, but at that moment. My comings and goings were not matters in which I was consulted. Panic fear raging within. Outwardly I was calm as possible, and stood, turning the revolvers over and over, asking myself what it could be that I was intended to do with them. All at once it came to me in an illuminating flash. I was to fire at the lock of the drawer, and blow it open. A madder scheme it would have been impossible to hit upon. The servants had slept through a good deal, but they would hardly sleep through the discharge of a revolver in a room below them, not to speak of the person who had just entered the premises, and whose footsteps were already audible as he came up the stairs. I struggled to make a dumb protest against the insensate folly which was hurrying me to infallible destruction, without success. For me there was only obedience. With a revolver in either hand I marched towards the bureau, as unconcernedly as if I would not have given my life to have escaped the denouement which I needed but a slight modicum of common sense to be aware was close at hand. I placed the muzzle of one of the revolvers against the keyhole of the drawer to which my unseen guide had previously directed me, and pulled the trigger. The lock was shattered. The contents of the drawer were at my mercy. I snatched up a bundle of letters, about which a pink ribbon was wrapped. Startled by a noise behind me, immediately following the report of the pistol, I glanced over my shoulder. The room door was open, and Mr. Lessingham was standing with the handle in his hand. Chapter 7. The great Paul Lessingham. He was in evening dress. He carried a small portfolio in his left hand. If the discovery of my presence startled him, as it could scarcely have failed to do, he allowed no sign of surprise to escape him. Paul Lessingham's impenetrability is proverbial. Whether on platforms addressing excited crowds, or in the midst of heated discussion in the House of Commons, all the world knows that his coolness remains unruffled. It is generally understood that he owes his success in the political arena in no slight measure to the adroitness which is born of his invulnerable presence of mind. He gave me a taste of its quality then. Standing in the attitude which has been familiarized to us by caricaturists, his feet apart, his broad shoulders well set back, his handsome head a little advanced, his keen blue eyes having in them something suggestive of a bird of prey considering just when, where, and how to pounce, he regarded me for some seconds in perfect silence. Whether outwardly I flinched I cannot say. Inwardly I know I did. When he spoke, it was without moving from where he stood, and in the calm, airy tones in which he might have addressed an acquaintance who had just dropped in. "May I ask, sir, to what I am indebted for the pleasure of your company?" He paused, as if waiting for my answer. When none came, he put his question in another form. "Pray, sir, who are you, and on whose invitation do I find you here?" As I still stood speechless, motionless, meeting his glance without a twitching of an eyebrow, nor a tremor of the hand, I imagined that he began to consider me with an even closer intentness than before, and that the, to say the least of it, peculiarity of my appearance caused him to suspect that he was face to face with an adventure of a peculiar kind. Whether he took me for a lunatic I cannot certainly say, but from his manner, I think it possible he did. He began to move towards me from across the room, addressing me with the utmost suavity and courtesy. "Be so good as to give me the revolver, and the papers you are holding in your hand." As he came on, something entered into me, and forced itself from between my lips, so that I said, in a low, hissing voice, which I vow was never mine, "The Beetle." Whether it was or was not, owing in some degree to a trick of my imagination I cannot determine, but as the words were spoken, it seemed to me that the lights went low, so that the place was all in darkness, and I again was filled with the nauseous consciousness of the presence of something evil in the room. But if, in that matter, my abnormally strained imagination played me a trick, there could be no doubt whatever as to the effect which the words had on Mr. Lessingham. When the mist of the blackness, real or supposititious, had passed from before my eyes, I found that he had retreated to the extremest limits of the room, and was crouching, his back against the bookshelves, clutching at them, in the attitude of a man who has received a staggering blow, from which, as yet, he has had no opportunity of recovering. A most extraordinary change had taken place in the expression of his face. In his countenance amazement, fear, and horror seemed struggling for the mastery. I was filled with a most discomforting qualm as I gazed at the frightened figure in front of me and realized that it was that of the great Paul Lessingham, the god of my political idolatry. "Who are you? In God's name, who are you?" His very voice seemed changed. His frenzied, choking accents would hardly have been recognized by either friend or foe. "Who are you? Do you hear me ask? Who are you? In the name of God, I bid you say." As he perceived that I was still, he began to show a species of excitement which it was unpleasant to witness, especially as he continued to crouch against the bookshelf, as if he was afraid to stand up straight. So far from exhibiting the impassivity for which he was renowned, all the muscles in his face and all the limbs in his body seemed to be in motion at once. He was like a man afflicted with the shivering ague. His very fingers were twitching aimlessly as they were stretched out on either side of him, as if seeking for support from the shelves against which he leaned. "Where have you come from? What do you want? Who sent you here? What concern have you with me? Is it necessary that you should come and play these childish tricks with me? Why? The questions came from him with astonishing rapidity. When he saw that I continued silent, they came still faster, mingled with what sounded to me like a stream of inchoate abuse. "Why do you stand there in that extraordinary garment? It's worse than nakedness, yes, worse than nakedness. For that alone I could have you punished, and I will, and try to play the fool. Do you think I am a boy to be bamboozled by every bogey a blunderer may try to conjure up? If so, you're wrong, as whoever sent you might have had sense enough to let you know. If you tell me who you are, and who sent you here, and what it is you want, I will be merciful. If not, the police shall be sent for, and the law shall take its course, to the bitter end. I warn you, do you hear, you fool? Tell me who you are." The last words came from him in what was very like a burst of childish fury. He himself seemed conscious, the moment after, that his passion was sadly lacking in dignity, and to be ashamed of it. He drew himself straight up. With a pocket handkerchief which he took from an inner pocket of his coat, he wiped his lips. Then, clutching it tightly in his hand, he eyed me with a fixedness which, under any other circumstances, I should have found unbearable. "Well, sir, is your continued silence part of the business of the role you have set yourself to play?" His tone was firmer, and his bearing more in keeping with his character. "If it be so, I presume that I, at least, have liberty to speak. When I find a gentleman, even one gifted with your eloquence of silence, playing the part of burglar, I think you will grant that a few words on my part cannot justly be considered to be out of place." Again he paused. No, I could not but feel that he was employing the vehicle of somewhat cumbrous sarcasm to gain time, and to give himself the opportunity of recovering, if the thing was possible, his pristine courage. That, for some cause wholly hidden from me, the mysterious utterance had shaken his nature to its deepest foundations, was made plainer by his endeavor to treat the whole business with a sort of cynical levity. "To commence with, may I ask if you have come through London, or through any portion of it, in that costume, or, rather, in that want of costume? It would seem out of place in a Cairene street, would it not? Even in the Rue de Robergas, was it not the Rue de Robergas?" He asked the question with an emphasis the meaning of which was wholly lost on me. What he referred to either then, or in what immediately followed, I of course knew no more than the man in the moon, though I should probably have found great difficulty in convincing him of my ignorance. "I take it that you are a reminiscence of the Rue de Robergas, that of course, is it not of course, the little house with the blue-grey Venetians, And the piano with the F sharp missing. Is there still the piano? With the tinny treble, indeed, the whole atmosphere, was it not tinny? You agree with me? I have not forgotten. I am not even afraid to remember. You perceive it. A new idea seemed to strike him, born, perhaps, of my continued silence. You look English? Is it possible that you are not English? What are you then, French? We shall see. He addressed me in a tongue which I recognized as French, but with which I was not sufficiently acquainted to understand. Although I flatter myself that, as the present narrative should show, I have not made an ill use of the opportunities which I have had to improve my, originally modest education, I regret that I have never had so much as a ghost of a chance to acquire an even rudimentary knowledge of any language except my own. Recognizing, I suppose, from my looks, that he was addressing me in a tongue to which I was a stranger, after a time he stopped, added something with a smile, and then began to talk to me in a lingo to which, in a manner of speaking, I was even stranger, for this time I had not the faintest notion what it was. It might have been gibberish for all that I could tell. Quickly perceiving that he had succeeded no better than before, he returned to English. You do not know French, nor the patois of the Rue de Robergas? Very good. Then what is it that you do know? Are you under a vow of silence, or are you dumb, except upon occasion? Your face is English, what can be seen of it? And I will take it, therefore, that English-spoken words convey some meaning to your brain. So listen, sir, to what I have to say. Do me the favor to listen carefully. He was becoming more and more his former self. In his clear, modulated tones there was a ring of something like a threat, a something which went very far beyond his words. You know something of a period which I choose to have forgotten. That is plain. You come from a person who probably knows still more. Go back to that person and say that what I have forgotten. Nothing will be gained by anyone by an endeavor to induce me to remember. Be very sure upon that point. Say that nothing will be gained by anyone. That time was one of mirage, of delusion, of disease. I was in a condition, mentally and bodily, in which pranks could have been played upon me by any trickster. Such pranks were played. I know that now quite well. I do not pretend to be proficient in the modus operandi of the hanky-panky man, but I know that he has a method, all the same one susceptible, too, of facile explanation. Go back to your friend, and tell him that I am not again likely to be made the butt of his old method, nor of his new one either. You hear me, sir? I remained motionless and silent, an attitude which, plainly, he resented. Are you deaf and dumb? You certainly are not dumb, for you spoke to me just now. Be advised by me, and do not compel me to resort to measures which will be the cause to you of serious discomfort. You hear me, sir? Still, from me, not a sign of comprehension to his increased annoyance. So be it. Keep your own counsel, if you choose. Yours will be the bitterness, not mine. You may play the lunatic, and play it excellently well, but that you do understand what is said to you is clear. Come to business, sir. Give me that revolver and the packet of letters which you have stolen from my desk. He had been speaking with the air of one who desired to convince himself as much as me, and about his last words there was almost a flavor, braggadocio. I remained unheeding. Are you going to do as I require, or are you insane enough to refuse? In which case I shall summon assistance, and there will quickly be an end of it. Pray do not imagine that you can trick me into supposing that you do not grasp the situation. I know better. Once more, are you going to give me that revolver and those letters? Yet no reply. His anger was growing momentarily greater, and his agitation too. On my first introduction to Paul Lessingham, I was not destined to discover in him any one of those qualities of which the world held him to be the undisputed possessor. He showed himself to be as unlike the statesman I had conceived and esteemed as he easily could have done. Do you think I stand in awe of you, of such a thing as you? Do as I tell you, or I myself will make you, and at the same time teach you a much-needed lesson. He raised his voice. In his bearing there was a would-be defiance. He might not have been aware of it, but the repetitions of the threats were, in themselves, confessions of weakness. He came a step or two forward, then, stopping short, began to tremble. The perspiration broke out upon his brow. He made spasmodic little dabs at it with his crumpled-up handkerchief. His eyes wandered hither and thither, as if searching for something which they feared to see yet were constrained to seek. He began to talk to himself, out loud, in odd disconnected sentences, apparently ignoring me entirely. What was that? It was nothing. It was my imagination. My nerves are out of order. I have been working too hard. I am not well. What's that? This last inquiry came from him in a half-stifled shriek, as the door opened to admit the head and body of an elderly man in a state of considerable undress. He had the tousled appearance of one who had been unexpectedly roused out of slumber and unwillingly dragged from bed. Mr. Lessingham stared at him as if he had been a ghost, while he stared back at Mr. Lessingham as if he found a difficulty in crediting incredence of his own eyes. It was he who broke the silence, stutteringly. I am sure, I beg your pardon, sir, but one of the maids thought that she heard the sound of a shot, and we came down to see if there was anything the matter, I had no idea, sir, that you were here. His eyes travelled from Mr. Lessingham towards me, suddenly increasing, when they saw me, to about twice their previous size. God save us. Who is that? The man's self-evident cowardice possibly impressed Mr. Lessingham with the conviction that he himself was not cutting the most dignified of figures. At any rate, he made a notable effort to, once more, assume a bearing of greater determination. You are quite right, Matthews, quite right. I am obliged by your watchfulness. At present you may leave the room. I propose to deal with this fellow myself. Only remain with the other men upon the landing, so that, if I call, you may come to my assistance. Matthews did as he was told. He left the room with, I fancy, more rapidity than he had entered it. Mr. Lessingham returned to me, his manner distinctly more determined, as if he found his resolution reinforced by the near neighbourhood of his retainers. Now, my man, you see how the case stands. At a word from me, you will be overpowered and doomed to undergo a long period of imprisonment. Yet I am still willing to listen to the dictates of mercy. Put down that revolver. Give me those letters. You will not find me disposed to treat you hardly. For all the attention I paid him, I might have been a graven image. He misunderstood, or pretended to misunderstand, the cause of my silence. Come, I see that you suppose my intentions to be harsher than they really are. Do not let us have a scandal and a scene. Be sensible. Give me those letters. Again he moved in my direction. Again, after he had taken a step or two, to stumble and stop, and look about him with frightened eyes, again to begin to mumble to himself aloud. It's a conjurer's trick. Of course, nothing more. What else could it be? I'm not to be fooled. I'm older than I was. I've been overdoing it. That's all. Suddenly he broke into cries. Matthews, Matthews, help, help. Matthews entered the room, followed by 3 other men, younger than himself. Evidently all had slipped into the first articles of clothing they could lay their hands upon, and each carried a stick or some similar rudimentary weapon. Their master spurred them on. Strike the revolver out of his hand, Matthews. Knock him down. Take the letters from him. Don't be afraid. I'm not afraid. In proof of it, he rushed at me, as it seemed half blindly. As he did so, I was constrained to shout out, in tones which I should not have recognized as mine. The Beetle. And that moment the room was all in darkness, and there were screams as of someone in an agony of terror or of pain. I felt that something had come into the room, I knew not whence nor how, something of horror. And the next action of which I was conscious was, that under cover of the darkness, I was flying from the room, propelled by I knew not what. Chapter 8. The Man in the Street. Whether anyone pursued, I cannot say. I have some dim recollection, as I came out of the room, of women being huddled against the wall upon the landing, and of their screaming as I went past, but whether any effort was made to arrest my progress I cannot tell. My own impression is that not the slightest attempt to impede my headlong flight was made by anyone. In what direction I was going I did not know. I was like a man flying through the phantasmagoric happenings of a dream, knowing neither how nor whither. I tore along what I suppose was a broad passage, through a door at the end into what I fancy was a drawing room. Across this room I dashed, helter-skelter, bringing down, in the gloom, unseen articles of furniture, with myself sometimes on top, and sometimes under them. In a trice, each time I fell, I was on my feet again, until I went crashing against a window which was concealed by curtains. It would not have been strange had I crashed through it, but I was spared that. Thrusting aside the curtains, I fumbled for the fastening of the window. It was a tall French casement, extending, so far as I could judge, from floor to ceiling. When I had it open I stepped through it onto the veranda without, to find that I was on the top of the portico which I had vainly essayed to ascend from below. I tried the road down which I had tried up, proceeding with a breakneck recklessness of which now I shudder to think. It was, probably, some 30 feet above the pavement, yet I rushed at the descent with as much disregard for the safety of life and limb as if it had been only 3. Over the edge of the parapet I went, obtaining, with my naked feet, a precarious foothold on the latticework. Then down I commenced to scramble. I never did get a proper hold, and when I had descended, perhaps, rather more than half the distance scraping, as it seemed to me, every scrap of skin off my body in the process, I lost what little hold I had. Down to the bottom I went tumbling, rolling right across the pavement into the muddy road. It was a miracle I was not seriously injured, but in that sense, certainly that night, the miracles were on my side. Hardly was I down, than I was up again, mud and all. Just as I was getting onto my feet, I felt a firm hand grip me by the shoulder. Turning, I found myself confronted by a tall, slenderly built man with a long, drooping moustache and an overcoat buttoned up to the chin, who held me with a grasp of steel. He looked at me, and I looked back at him. After the ball, eh? Even then I was struck by something pleasant in his voice, and some quality as of sunshine in his handsome face. Seeing that I said nothing, he went on, with a curious, half-mocking smile. Is that the way to come slithering down the Apostles' Pillar? Is it simple burglary, or simpler murder? Tell me the glad tidings that you've killed St. Paul, and I'll let you go. Whether he was mad or not, I cannot say. there was some excuse for thinking so. He did not look mad, though his words and actions alike were strange. Although you have confined yourself to gentle felony, shall I not shower blessings on the head of him who has been robbing Paul? Away with you. You. He removed his grip, giving me a gentle push as he did so, and I was away. I neither stayed nor paused. I knew little of records, but if anyone has made a better record than I did that night between Lowndes Square and Walham Green, I should like to note just what it was. I should, too, like to have seen it done. In an incredibly short space of time, I was once more in front of the house with the open window, the packet of letters which were like to have cost me so dear, gripped tightly in my hand. Chapter 9. The contents of the packet. I pulled up sharply, as if a brake had been suddenly, and even mercilessly, applied to bring me to a standstill. In front of the window I stood shivering. A shower had recently commenced. The falling rain was being blown before the breeze. I was in a terrible sweat, yet tremulous as with cold, covered with mud, bruised and cut, and bleeding, as piteous an object as you would care to see. Every limb in my body ached, every muscle was exhausted. Mentally and physically I was done, had I not been held up, willy-nilly, by the spell which was upon me. I should have sunk down, then and there, in a hopeless, helpless, hapless heap. But my tormentor was not yet at an end with me. As I stood there like some broken and beaten hack, waiting for the word of command, it came. It was as if some strong magnetic current had been switched on to me through the window to draw me into the room. Over the low wall I went, over the sill. Once more I stood in that chamber of my humiliation and my shame, and once again I was conscious of that awful sense of the presence of an evil thing. How much of it was fact, and how much of it was the product of imagination, I cannot say. But looking back, it seems to me that it was as if I had been taken out of the corporeal body to be plunged into the inner chambers of all nameless sin. There was the sound of something flopping from off the bed onto the ground, and I knew that the thing was coming at me across the floor. My stomach quaked, my heart melted within me. The very anguish of my terror gave me strength to scream and scream. Sometimes, even now, I seem to hear those screams of mine ringing through the night, and I bury my face in the pillow. And it is as though I was passing through the very valley of the shadow. The thing went back. I could hear it slipping and sliding across the floor. There was silence, and presently the lamp was lit, and the room was all in brightness. There, on the bed, in the familiar attitude between the sheets, his head resting on his hand, his eyes blazing like living coals, was the dreadful cause of all my agonies. He looked at me with his unpitying, unblinking glance. So, through the window again, like a thief. Is it always through that door that you come into a house? He paused, as if to give me time to digest his gibe. You saw Paul Lessingham? Well, the great Paul Lessingham? Was he then so great? His rasping voice, with its queer foreign twang, reminded me, in some uncomfortable way, of a rusty saw. The things he said, and the manner in which he said them, were alike intended to add to my discomfort. It was solely because the feat was barely possible that he only partially succeeded. Like a thief you went into his house. Did I not tell you that you would? Like a thief he found you. Were you not ashamed? Since, like a thief he found you, how comes it that you have escaped? By what robber's artifice have you saved yourself from gaol? His manner changed, so that, all at once, he seemed to snarl at me. Is he great? Well, is he great, Paul Lessingham? You are small, but he is smaller. Your great Paul Lessingham. Was there ever a man so less than nothing? With the recollection fresh upon me of Mr. Lessingham as I had so lately seen him, I could not but feel that there might be a modicum of truth in what, with such an intensity of bitterness, the speaker suggested. The picture which, in my mental gallery, I had hung in the place of honor, seemed, to say the least, to have become a trifle smudged. As usual, the man in the bed seemed to experience not the slightest difficulty in deciphering what was passing through my mind. That is so, you and he, you are a pair. The great Paul Lessingham is as great a thief as you, and greater, for, at least, than you. He has more courage. For some moments he was still, then exclaimed, with sudden fierceness, Give me what you have stolen. I moved towards the bed most unwillingly, and held out to him the packet of letters which I had abstracted from the little drawer. Perceiving my disinclination to his near neighborhood, he set himself to play with it. Ignoring my outstretched hand, he stared me straight in the face. What ails you? Are you not well? Is it not sweet to stand close at my side? You, with your white skin, if I were a woman, would you not take me for a wife? There was something about the manner in which this was said which was so essentially feminine, that once more I wondered if I could possibly be mistaken in the creature's sex. I would have given much to have been able to strike him across the face, or, better, to have taken him by the neck, and thrown him through the window, and windowed him in the mud. He condescended to notice what I was holding out to him. So, that is what you have stolen. That is what you have taken from the drawer in the bureau, the drawer which was locked, and which you used the arts in which a thief is skilled to enter. Give it to me, thief. He snatched the packet from me, scratching the back of my hand as he did so, as if his nails had been talons. He turned the packet over and over. glaring at it as he did so. It was strange what a relief it was to have his glance removed from off my face. "You kept it in your inner drawer, Paul Lessingham, where none but you could see it, did you? You hid it as one hides treasure. There should be something here worth having, worth seeing, worth knowing. Yes, worth knowing, since you found it worth your while to hide it up so closely." As I have said, the packet was bound about by a string of pink ribbon, a fact on which he presently began to comment. "With what a pretty string you have encircled it, and how neatly it is tied. Surely only a woman's hand could tie a knot like that. Who would have guessed yours were such agile fingers? So, an endorsement on the cover. What's this? Let's see what's written. 'The letters of my dear love, Marjorie Linden.'" As he read these words, which, as he said, were endorsed upon the outer sheet of paper which served as a cover for the letters which were enclosed within, his face became transfigured. Never did I suppose that rage could have so possessed a human countenance. His jaw dropped open so that his yellow fangs gleamed through his parted lips. He held his breath so long that each moment I looked to see him fall down in a fit. The veins stood out all over his face, and head like seams of blood. I know not how long he continued speechless. When his breath returned, it was with chokings and gaspings, in the midst of which he hissed out his words, as if their mere passage through his throat brought him near to strangulation. The letters of his dear love, his, Paul Lessingham's. So, it is as I guessed, as I knew as I saw. Marjorie Linden, sweet Marjorie, his dear love, Paul Lessingham's dear love, she with the lily face, the corn-hued hair. What is it his dear love has found in her fond heart to write Paul Lessingham? Sitting up in bed, he tore the packet open. It contained, perhaps, 8 or 9 letters, some mere notes, some long epistles, but short or long, he devoured them with equal appetite, each one over and over again, till I thought he never would have done rereading them. They were on thick white paper, of a peculiar shade of whiteness, with untrimmed edges. On each sheet a crest and an address were stamped in gold, and all the sheets were of the same shape and size. I told myself that if anywhere, at any time, I saw writing paper like that again, I should not fail to know it. The calligraphy was, like the paper, unusual, bold, decided, and, I should have guessed, produced by a J pen. All the time that he was reading he kept emitting sounds, more resembling yelps and snarls than anything more human, like some savage beast nursing its pent-up rage. When he had made an end of reading, for the season, he let his passion have full vent. So, that is what his dear love has found it in her heart to write Paul Lessingham. Paul Lessingham. Pen cannot describe the concentrated frenzy of hatred with which the speaker dwelt upon the name. It was demoniac. It is enough. It is the end. It is his doom. He shall be ground between the upper and the nether stones in the towers of anguish, and all that is left of him shall be cast on the accursed stream of the bitter waters, to stink under the blood-grimed sun. And for her, for Marjorie Linden, for his dear love, it shall come to pass that she shall wish that she was never born, nor he, and the gods of the shadows shall smell the sweet incense of her suffering. It shall be. It shall be. It is I that say it, even I. In the madness of his rhapsodical frenzy, I believed that he had actually forgotten I was there, but on a sudden, glancing aside, he saw me, and remembered, and was prompt to take advantage of an opportunity to wreak his rage upon a tangible object. "It is you, you thief, you still live, to make a mock of one of the children of the gods." He leapt, shrieking, off the bed, and sprang at me, clasping my throat with his horrid hands, bearing me backwards onto the floor. I felt his breath mingle with mine, and then God, in his mercy, sent oblivion. This concludes the first part of 10 total of The Beetle by Richard Marsh, produced by Best Audio Books for free.